Hi, everybody. Good evening and welcome to the Finding You podcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Wednesday, May 28, 2025. Tonight's broadcast actually is historically similar to one that is our most listened to broadcast of all time, the Identified Patient and You. So I'm going to be talking tonight about some new ideas with regard to the identified patient and really in the context of finding you, what the implications are for the work that you have to do, for the work that is your project in this whole dynamic. Before I get into that, let me get into our upcoming announcements, events, and so forth. The June 4th Finding You is full. The next available Finding You is July 23rd through 27th. There is limited spaces, only a couple of spots left. So if you're interested, please inquire sooner rather than later. After that, we have September 3rd, and now we've listed the rest of them throughout the year, October 1st, November 5th, and December 3rd. We'll be announcing our online Finding You soon, and I'm going to be running a Finding Connection workshop, which is similar to the Finding You, but for couples, with my wife, Michelle, June 18th through 22nd. There's still a spot available there. Any inquiries, any private intensives, anything Finding You, you can email us at info@findingyouprograms.com. That's info@findingyouprograms.com. And of course, don't forget about our coaching and therapy services. So if you're looking for a therapist or a coach who follows the same kind of philosophy that we talk about on this broadcast, you can contact us at our email there. Coming sooner rather than later, is the Finding You Inner Circle. This is a subscription and a support of the Finding You podcast. So you'll be available for the live broadcast and also for a couple that will only be for our subscribers. If you are Finding You alumni specifically, you'll be automatically enrolled in that program. If not, you can sign up for a very nominal fee. So like I said, tonight I'm going to talk about the identified patient, what that means, and what are the implications for you and your work, especially in the context of Finding You and the Finding You Intensives coaching and therapy. The way to think about the identified patient is to think about them in terms of the most sensitive person in the system. That doesn't mean that they're the most weak. It might mean that they are the most vulnerable, but really what it means is that they can feel and sense and tend to respond to the system, its context, its communication more than everybody else. So they become this kind of symbol, this crystallization of the family health and the family pathology. And the symptoms that they bear, the diagnoses, the behaviors that they exhibit that are troubling, are often best understood in the context of the family system. In fact, one of the founders of family therapy, specifically something that we call structural family therapy, which talks about boundaries, talks about triangulation, comes from a man by the name of Salvador Minuchin, who originally studied families at the Child Family Guidance Clinic in Philadelphia in the 1970s. And what he observed was that the blood sugar would adjust according to the level of parental conflict. He dealt with people that were diabetic or pre-diabetic, specifically children, and he found that the level of tension that was being exhibited by the parents would affect the physiology of the child in the family. And there were other systems, other diagnoses that he looked at. And so he started to say that it doesn't make sense to simply look at somebody's, even their physiology, in terms of the individual context, but that we have to pan out, step back, and look at the broader context. And that symptom of the change in blood sugar could be a measure, a barometer of how the family is doing. So the identified patient manifests symptoms that draw our attention ideally to the system. Although one of the ways that the identified patient serves the system is for members to become distracted from the systemic issues and to focus on the health and pathology of the individual. If I can focus on my child's struggle with mental health and mental illness, then I don't have to address my own sense of inadequacies, my own depression, my own existential angst. I don't have to deal with my partner and the quality of our marriage because we are in triage, right? We are focused on our struggling and suffering child. So the very idea of the symptom bearer itself is that it serves to distract the family from the underlying principles. It is a convenient distraction, as they say. Part of that is because they are sensitive, but I'm talking about sensitivity not as a negative or a liability. I'm talking about the one that feels the most. Of course, in a distressed environment, feeling the most is going to be painful and uncomfortable, but they tend to be the truth tellers, the ones that are drawing attention because of their anger, their pain, to the things in the system that are not working for them and really not working for everybody. Oftentimes, the identified patient becomes that person in a familial lineage who decides to get into therapy. Ideally, they pull the family into therapy so that the family can begin to shift its legacy, its generational transmission of pathology and health. So there's a sensitivity. Think of the identified patient as the person who feels the most. Oftentimes, it's not something that is done simply in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is, yes, the identified patient is sensitive and they feel the most, but, or I should say, and there's a lot of projection onto the identified patient. Once they become the symptom bearer, like I mentioned earlier, they serve the system by drawing attention to them so that people don't have to deal with the other things that are right in front of them. So there's this projection, this induction. The identified patient is called to a role, to fulfill a role for the system. So they sign up for that unconsciously, typically. But also everybody else is very happy to enroll them as the problem bearer, as the symptom bearer for the family. They become the most symptomatic. And early on, we call them the scapegoat or the identified patient in treatment terms. But ultimately, they also become the hero. Invariably. This was my experience in my career, has been my experience in my career, that the child, for example, if they are the identified patient that is struggling, the child serves to wake the family up, to bring the family into therapy. Parents and siblings who love the identified patient will seek out, will ask questions, seek out answers for what they think is going to help the identified patient. But the fact of the matter is, any therapy that looks at the family system is going to put the onus back on the family members and say, what's your participation? Are you enabling? Are you rescuing? How are you co-participating in the problem? What are the unmet needs that you have that the symptom bearer or the identified patient is drawing attention to? How is this system not serving all of its members? And so many people will say, well, my other children are fine, or everybody else in the family seems to be doing fine. But people that are drawn in by the love of that one suffering child, that one suffering person in the family, will eventually find themselves in rooms where they'll be provided a mirror to look at themselves and to understand how they're participating in really a systemic failure. A parent who wrote a blog for us many years ago titled it something along the lines of, the greatest present were wrapped in the ugliest wrapping paper. That symptom bearer draws the family members into Al-Anon, into CODA, into psychotherapy, into family weekends, into parent education or education around depression or substance abuse. Oftentimes, the more the symptom becomes involved, we become aware that there are other silent symptom bearers in the family. That while the identified patient is the most obvious person suffering from symptoms, from diagnosis, from self-medicating, self-sabotaging behaviors, the fact of the matter is that there are more invisible, insidious individuals suffering from individual dynamics, issues. So they become the lightning rod, where the lightning goes. They become the scapegoat. I'll talk about that as we go on today. That motif, that metaphor of the scapegoat that we have in Judaism and in the Old Testament. And ultimately, they become the hero. They become the one who tells the truth, the one who brought everybody else into greater consciousness, into greater awareness if everybody participates in that. Oftentimes, I think about the identified patient in terms of a vehicle accident, a car accident. It doesn't matter who's driving, doesn't matter if you're a driver or a passenger, you still need support. You still need attention. You're still in need of healing. So we don't really think of when we meet somebody, we're always looking at their context. Sometimes that context is historical. If we're talking about an older adult, where did you come from? What happened to you? Is the language that the psychotherapist will use and even teach with. But we also look at the current context. How does this symptom serve the greater system? What is being asked from the unconscious inside of the identified patient? What's the question? Where does our attention go? Everybody needs help in healing. Now, I want to make this as clear as I can tonight. If you are, quote unquote, the non-identified patient, not the primary symptom bearer, you getting better, you doing your work in healing does not automatically fix the identified patient. They still have some choice, some participation, some agency in the matter. The only thing that your healing does is heal you. And in healing you, it removes you from a dynamic that you might be unconsciously supporting. I will say to parents, I'll say to spouses, how are you participating with the identified patient in a way that inadvertently, unconsciously reinforces the very behaviors, the very dynamics that you're here worried about, upset about, complaining about? So I want to draw this line both in terms of the pathology and the healing, that this is not a cause and effect relationship. In fact, if I were to suggest, even unconsciously were to suggest, that you getting better, becoming more boundary, becoming more clear about who you are and what your project is, healing your own trauma, your own background, unraveling your own programming, your own way of operating and thinking. Even if you do that, that doesn't necessarily fix the person who's suffering with symptoms in the family. It just removes you as part of the problem. Our children, our spouses stretch us. Joseph Campbell famously taught when speaking about marriage that marriage has nothing to do with being happy. Marriage is about transformation. Parenting has nothing to do with being happy. It's about transformation. You can't just dictate and control. You have to yield. You have to submit. You have to surrender. You have to stretch and grow. And so much of what I talk about, because I think of myself often as speaking to the non-identified patient. In fact, we did an exercise at work a couple of years ago, and we were identifying who are the audience members for this podcast, who are the audience members for the Finding You programming that we do. And my first thought was, it's really for the non-identified patient, the one who doesn't see themselves as the primary patient in the family. And that's who I'm often speaking to. So our children, our relationships stretch us. I made the joke some years ago that getting married and having children is very, very difficult, very painful. A horrible idea, I said tongue in cheek. Unfortunately, I went on to say, I don't know of any other participation in any other dynamic that will cause us so much growth, so much enlargement. So dealing with the identified patient, we can write them off, we can alienate them, we can close ourselves off to them, or we can answer the call that we feel in our hearts, the call of love, to see what we can do to help, to find ourselves on podcasts like this, reading books, self-help books, therapy, 12 steps. And inevitably, what we will discover is that we have some part in this systemic process, of which they are only just one symptom, the loudest symptom bearer in the family. Like I said, I think of codependency often as co-participation. I don't think of it as cause and effect. In fact, if I were to suggest, consciously or unconsciously, that it is a cause and effect, that you somehow cause the pathology and you can somehow cure the pathology in another, I'm prescribing the disease, not the cure. I'm giving you the poison, not the elixir that heals. And I think we do a disservice. I think many people do a disservice in their want or their need to emphasize so much that it's a systemic process. They cross a line and suggest that you're getting better will cause the primary sufferer to get better. But what happens is you find your way into classes, you find your way listening to podcasts, you find your way in rooms that you would have not otherwise visited. And then comes the transformation. If you stick with it long enough, you start to hear something different. You start to hear that those classes, those groups, those podcasts, those books are not really for helping equip you with the skills, the tools, the ideas that are going to fix another person. They're really equipping you with ideas and skills and tools that will heal you, that will address your unspoken, unconsidered trauma. And the family does restructure. I once gave a presentation a few years back. In fact, it's almost been 10 years now. It's been 10 years. I gave a presentation with a friend of mine who's an interventionist. And part of what we talked about in intervention was the intervention. Yes, the goal of the intervention is often specifically aimed at getting the identified patient into treatment. But again, because we don't want to put the responsibility for the identified patient, we don't want to put our responsibility, whatever that is, onto them. We talked and taught about the idea that intervention is about reorganizing the family. The family becomes organized around a pathology, a child, a spouse, a sibling's pathology. Everybody is considering their lives in relationship to that person. And the intervention is meant to unravel that, to give people a clear path toward healing and health, to stop focusing on the project of fixing the identified patient, and to start working on and addressing the only project that we have control over, which is ourselves. That shift that I just mentioned, that shift has incredible power, powerful and long-reaching ripple effects in our family and even outside of our family. So the family becomes restructured. The scapegoat eventually becomes the hero. The scapegoat hears things from parents and siblings and spouses like, I would not have chosen this path. I would not have wanted you to suffer. But the fact of the matter is you brought me into greater consciousness. You gave me a gift. There's a famous quote that says, even I realized years later that somebody gave me a box with a gift full of darkness, a box full of darkness. And now I realize what a gift it was. The things that we dreaded the most require us to confront and to deal with those parts of ourselves that we have not been dealing with, that we have been avoiding. And in that, we heal. In that, we become a healing agent in our family, not a cause of healing, but a healing agent, somebody who facilitates and encourages healing in the family. My daughter Emma talked about this thing, and I think it's really important, especially for parents, but it could be for spouses too. She talked about the 3 stages of psychological development. And she said the first stage in the infant, right? The infant can't tell the difference between self and other. A young child has no sense of other. They experience everything as a reflection of them. If mom is upset, if dad is upset, the child experiences at a very deep level, something's wrong with me. I need to change, because if I don't change in a way that's going to relieve mother and father from their upset, from their frustration, they could abandon me or punish me. And in either case, I suffer even greater distress. So I have to figure out how to be the solution. So I'm the problem. That's the first stage. I'm bad. The second stage, which comes along through adolescence typically is, you are bad. Everybody else is the bad one, not me. I own no fault in this project, in this situation. And this is a necessary stage for people to go through, right? Teenagers, I used to say that my favorite way to get the attention of the teenage clients that I work with was just to start out by saying, I already know your parents are idiots. And they would look at me like I had a crystal ball that I could see, that I could see, read people's minds. I had x-ray vision of some kind. The identified patient in virtually every setting that I value as a treatment program, but virtually every setting, the identified patient will eventually be called to tell the people in his or her or their family how they were hurt by them. And that might sound strange to you. Why is the identified patient the one who seems to be causing the most upheaval, the most distress? Why are they talking about how I, who relative to them, bear few symptoms, why are they talking about how I hurt them? Shouldn't it be the other way around, people think? But this is a way of giving the identified patient a place to put their pain, a place to express and to feel their anger. Now, the third stage, the adult stage, which very few people arrive at, is everybody's bad, or we're all human. Right? Those are the same things. Everybody's bad and we're all human are the same sentiments, the same energy. And as adults, we always want to pull people into that third stage. But here's the trick. Here's the rub. If you try to pull somebody into stage 3, where we're all human, when they're in stage 2, which is everybody else is the problem, they will often regress back to stage 1. And stage 1, if you remember, is I am bad. And stage 1 is an untenable place to live in the long term. Stage 1 is likely to have with it a lot of self-harming, self-sabotaging, dangerous self-medicating behaviors. So we have to, as loved ones, tolerate stage 2. We have to listen to the pain of the identified patient, even if we don't agree with it, if we don't see that things went down the way that they're saying, if we have enough capacity to listen and to hold space as they sort it out. We've given them now a venue, a stage to express their pain so they don't direct it inward. It's important to be ready for homeostatic energy no matter where you fit in tonight's talk, tonight's podcast. The idea that anytime one person in a system changes, that the system is going to try to pull them back to homeostasis. Harriet Lerner famously says in her book, The Dance of Anger, we need to prepare ourselves when setting healthy boundaries with loved ones. We need to prepare ourselves for the quote unquote change back energy, change back messaging. And I teach this all the time to non-identified patients. As you get healthier, even as the identified patient, as you get healthier, the people that are close to you, that love you, are apt to say, likely to say, change back. So you're going to have to face that adversary that is dressed and looks like someone who loves us, because it's uncomfortable, right? Change is difficult. Change doesn't make sense. If it made sense, we would all be instructed on the healthiest relationship and behavioral patterns, and by and large, we would all change. But it's terrifying. It's lonely. We will experience great shame and guilt. In family systems theory, we learn about equal finality and equal potentiality, which says that somebody can come from a very different circumstance from me and end up in the same place. I could have had a really nurturing, connected family, become a social worker, helping children that are abused and neglected. And another person could have come from a very abusive and neglectful home and decided that they wanted to help children like themselves. Or you can have people that come from the same background, right? that end up in two very different places. So systems theory doesn't reduce things down to simple linear cause and effect. Systems theory is much more complex than that. Systems theory is like the weather, like the universe, like an ecosystem. We can't really predict it. The variables are too complex, too many, too unknowable. But we begin to see patterns, and we can interrupt the patterns. And that's what this is about. Where we punctuate a systemic interaction is arbitrary. You might say as a spouse, well, I don't tell the truth because you're always so reactive. I don't think you can handle it. Or the partner could say, well, I don't trust you. And so I'm reactive because you're very untrustworthy. Where you punctuate that cycle, and you could see how that cycle could snowball. Where you punctuate it is arbitrary and unimportant. But we often do punctuate it to make sense out of it. More than anything else, if a loved one that you're close to is suffering, fits the name, the label of the identified patient, the best thing that you can do for them is to model humility and vulnerability. To learn to not try to control for outcomes, to tell the truth, to work on yourselves. In essence, we have to get out of cause and effect thinking to become a part of the solution. In cause and effect thinking, we reduced people in our lives to objects. I can go over to the wall over here in this room and I can flip the light switch. It has virtually no choice. Literally no choice. And whether or not I flip it up or down. That's an object. Now, if I went downstairs to my daughter and gave her a directive or an ask, she has choice in the matter. She's a subject, not an object. But if I treat her like an object, which I will confess, I've treated my children and my wife like objects numerous times. And I get frustrated when they don't comply with my demands, with what I dictate. But because I love them and because I haven't run away yet, because I stay in relationship to them, to find peace, I have to grow, I have to stretch. The question I get asked very often in psychotherapy is, I don't want to be a doormat with my children or my spouse, my siblings, my friends, my parents. I don't want to be a doormat, but I don't want to be too rigid. Right? I don't want to be too set in my ways, inflexible, uncompromising. So the implied question is, where's the sweet spot? And my answer to that question is, that's the right question. You get to decide. You see, that's one of the big messages of the 12-step programs that support the non-identified patient is you get to decide. You don't get to be right. You don't get to come out on top. You don't get to be good. You get to be you, which is so much better, so much more of a liberating experience. But you have to give up on the being good, the being right, the being in charge, to stay in relationship with other subjects, with other people, with other humans. I love the 12 steps because if you are a participant, you work through the steps, you eventually practice a 10th step. It's basically an amends, a daily amends process. I've said this numerous times, how much better the world would be if everybody attended a 12-step group, a fellowship, and was accountable for their mistakes, was committed to making amends where they hurt other people, was committed to making their life their responsibility, not the responsibility of the identified patient. Here's the thing about the identified patient. They're already struggling and suffering. And if you outsource your serenity, your peace, your happiness to the identified patient, especially if the identified patient is a child, especially if you outsource your peace of mind, your serenity, your well-being to the identified patient, I would argue they're not doing well. They can't bear it. It is a crushing weight. So you have to take that back. We have to come to the point in our own growth where we say, I'm responsible for my own life, for my own happiness. Yes, I have children. Yes, I have a spouse. Yes, I have loved ones that I'm close to. But I can't make them responsible for the meaning, the joy in my life. I have to be responsible for myself. And that is a big transformation for most people. In our quest for a peace of mind, we often project our inner turmoil onto those we love, asking them to bear the weight of our unresolved fears and unacknowledged sins, primarily the sin of unconsciousness. This mirrors the ancient ritual described in the Old Testament, where the scapegoat is sent into the wilderness, laden with the transgressions of the community. As Carl Jung might suggest, this act of displacing our shadows, our unconscious, onto another not only burdens them, but also perpetuates our own inner disquiet. We don't deal with ourselves. Until the unconscious, until the shadow is integrated into our personality, the world appears filled with opponents or adversaries who are actually the products of the unconscious. When we fail to confront our own darkness, we inadvertently ask others to carry that which we refuse to acknowledge. Thus, let us not turn our kin into scapegoats, for their journey is not to bear our sins, but to walk alongside us in the pursuit of wholeness. Carl Jung talks about this idea that if we don't take back our shadow, the parts of us that we have relegated to the unconscious, for example, the responsibility for our own joy and happiness, our own meaning, our own peace, if we don't integrate that back into ourselves, we will experience evil outside of us. We will experience our own unconscious as fate happening outside of us. That is powerful. We will see it as events. It's because of this presidential administration that I am unhappy. It's because of what's going on in the world that's making me unhappy. It's because of my child. It's because of my partner that I am unhappy. Yes, they present challenges. Yes, not all is going well with everybody all the time. But the gurus, the mystics, all agree on this one idea, that we are responsible for our own happiness, for our own lives. In a two-person system, we call this outsourcing of our own happiness, our own well-being, we call it projection. We see the problem in them. My child is using drugs, that's why I'm not happy. My wife is depressed, that's why I'm not happy. That's projection. Commonly in family systems, we experience a more complex form of projection that we call triangulation. That is where instead of the spouses dealing with their relationship, they project their energy onto the child. I cannot tell you the numbers of times I have become conscious of the fact that the anger I'm having toward my child is something I need to deal with my wife about. I'm mad on the surface at their behavior, but mostly I'm mad at their behavior because of how my wife reacts to it. And instead of dealing with her, the other adult in the family, I want the child to behave themselves. So we take the anxiety, the unexpressed, the undealt with issues between the couple, and we project them onto the child, and we call that triangulation. This is the most common dynamic in a family that we talk about in psychotherapy, this triangulation. Jung said our unwillingness to see our own faults and the projection of them is the beginning of most quarrels. And it is the strongest guarantee that injustice, animosity, and persecution are not ready to die out. Psychological projection is a defense mechanism where a person subconsciously denies or splits off parts of his or her own attributes, thoughts, and emotions, which are often ascribed to the outside world, usually to other people. Thus, projection involves imagining or projecting the belief that others originate and cause those feelings in us. Projection serves us because it reduces anxiety by allowing the expression of the unwanted, unconscious impulses or desires without letting the conscious mind recognize them. It's easier to see them out there. And that thing that I was referring to about experiencing it as an event, the specific quote from Carl Jung reads this way: whatever is rejected from the self appears in the world as an event. But there's good news about projection. There's good news for the non-identified patient. For as James Hollis says, all projection occurs unconsciously, of course. For the moment that you observe, I have made a projection, you are already in the process of taking it back. More commonly, we only begin to reclaim our purchase on consciousness when the other person fails to catch, hold, or reflect our projection, when it doesn't seem to fit, when they don't react to it, they don't capitulate or respond or become defensive about it. If there's an essential law of the psyche, it is that what was unconscious will be projected. This is why it is observed that in the quote, when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. This is why it's so important to become conscious. The more conscious you become, the more you realize you have so much material to be working on yourself that you don't have time to think about and obsess over the faults, the weaknesses, the mental illnesses of others. And by doing your work on your mental health and your mental illness, you contribute to all the people around you, to the peace and the serenity to all the people around you. And you stop becoming someone who's feeding that idea that the other person is the problem. For decades, literally now for decades, when I'm teaching some of these things, people will often say to me, and this is some version of something I've heard hundreds of times, I feel shame when I hear you talk about this stuff. Although you don't say it, I still consider my child's issues as my fault. And I've struggled with how to respond to that over the years. I've made emphasis, like I have tonight, over it's not a cause and effect, but more a systemic, a complex system. In fact, if you want to feel blamed and shamed for what you've done, go ahead. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So if it's true for you, you can blame your parents on that. And they don't need to wear the heavy burden. They don't need to become the scapegoat, so they can pass it on to their parents. And so forth and so on. I've also made this point, I think most importantly. This is not about shame and guilt. When I describe things that we do that are unhealthy, one of the reasons why I tell so many examples of me screwing it up is so you don't have that experience that I'm sitting here self-actualized and complete. But I, like all the other professionals that you know, all of the other professionals that you know, are still struggling. The shame and the guilt is programming from your background, from our background. And most often, my experience is shame and guilt isn't a motivator to do better. It's just meant to make us feel bad. Really, it was how we were controlled when we were young, how all people are controlled. People don't know another way except for shame and guilt. That's the only way that most people imagine that change will occur. But there is something deeper than that. There is something richer than shame and guilt that can motivate you for change, and that is love, empathy, connection, compassion. And it's best expressed, this love, by us owning our own journey. To acknowledge the shadows we cast upon our children is not to dwell in shame, but to embrace the truth of our shared humanity. As Carl Jung wisely noted, the primary cause of neuroses often lies within the parental influence. This recognition transforms the burden of responsibility into an opportunity for healing and growth. If we are a part of the problem in the system, then we can be a part of the solution. It's not about shame or guilt. This is a description, not an indictment, not a judgment. By understanding the profound impact of our presence, of how we show up, we can guide our children toward wholeness, turning cycles of anxiety into journeys of compassion and understanding. what we can accomplish as a family is to extricate ourselves from reinforcing patterns in a system. Change the project. When families come to finding you to do family work, the parents will invariably say that I came here thinking that the project was one thing, and now it's another. Now it's me. And while that news landed heavy to begin with, I now see its wisdom and its liberation. And the family begins to reorganize, to change, to shift, to be different with each other. I'm going to be talking about this next week when I talk about behavioral therapy. But really, the transformation is a different way of thinking. We have to think different thoughts, thoughts that we have become wedded to about life, about relationships, about good, bad, right, wrong, mental health, mental illness, spirituality, God. I don't care what it is. We have to think new thoughts, become different people. You know that old adage, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear? What that means is there has to be a fundamental change before you can even hear the message. Ideally, at Finding You, we give everybody a chance to heal. Like I said at the beginning, I think of Finding You as a place for the non-identified patient. Most often, the crisis that people come with to our program is the suffering of a loved one. And we will meet you there. We will meet you at that place. But over time, the project is going to shift from the other person to you. Not because of shame, not because of blame, not because of cause and effect, but because you are the project. You're not their problem. You're your problem. You've defined your problem in the context of the identified patient, but it's not the identified patient. Each individual in the family has a voice. Each in the family, buddy in the family gets to be heard. If we do it well, and I think we do a lot of the time, the identified patient they walk away from the family intervention feeling heard at the deepest level they will tell us that they ever have been heard. And this becomes a template for knowing how to love themselves, is by loving and understanding them. We meet the family system through the identified patient. That's oftentimes how therapy begins. Therapy for most people is uncomfortable at best, terrifying for many. So the only reason that people will get in is if they are suffering so greatly or somebody that they love is suffering. So we'll meet you wherever you're at. If you've already made the turn and you recognize that you're your problem, we'll meet you there gladly. If the complaint is a struggling child or a marriage that's on the rocks, we'll meet you there too. We learn and we teach to honor the defenses, to see that the defenses serve a purpose. The defenses are there to protect the person who doesn't feel safe. And because defenses become a kind of pathology themselves, they become the symptom, the diagnosis, the identifiable problem. It's important that we remember to honor the message, to honor where they come from, to honor how they serve the individual, not just tear the defenses away or confront the defenses or smash them with a mallet. We learn that mental health and mental illness is something that we are all on the continuum of. Jamie Gill said in one of her books, it's important to recognize that the defense is doing important psychological work, or the energy required to maintain the defense wouldn't make any sense. Ripping away defenses does not improve the situation. Taking them away before the person is able to tolerate what the defense is masked leaves the person worse off than before. At least before, with the defense, he or she could function. Now, he or she is in shambles. He or she is incapable. Both cruel people, she says, and inadequate therapists are famous for a desire to destroy defenses without considering the consequences. I'm going to read that last sentence again, and I want you to think about this with the identified patient or patients in your life, or for you if you're the identified patient. Both cruel people and inadequate therapists are famous for a desire to destroy defenses without considering the consequences. Of course we do. We see the defenses as the problem. We don't hear the message that they offer. We don't hear the ask that they ask. We see the suffering that they cause and we want to get rid of them. But it's important to pause, to listen, to understand, to be curious about the defense. Considering the non-identified patient, oftentimes referred to in systems where there's mental health issues as somebody suffering from codependency. A codependent person is one who has let another person's behavior affect him or her, and who is obsessed with controlling or fixing that person's behavior. That was by Melanie Beattie. In the same way, codependents will not conclude that since efforts to stop the addict have been futile, there is no way of controlling the addict. Rather, and often this is how they present in therapy, they just look for better ways to control the addict, better ways to control the depressive person, better way to control the suffering loved one. And if you tried something over and over again and it hasn't worked, which most of us do in these cycles, these dynamics, these systems, it might not be the identified patient who's the slow learner. We, in fact, might be the slow learner. So we find our way in through the defense. We honor it. We listen to it. We get curious about it. We try not to treat anybody in the family like an object, something that can be controlled with no agency. We learn to be wrong, and we stay clear and on guard for the risk of trying to be a good parent, a good spouse, a good therapist. If I need to be good as a spouse, as a parent, or as a therapist, and you're upset with me, then you must be wrong because I'm right. You see, that's the insidious nature in relationships of trying to be good. If you have to be good, a good parent, a good friend, a good spouse, a good sibling, a good family member, a good therapist even, if that's something you need to be, then everybody else is going to be seen as the one bearing the problem. So we learn to listen a lot. We learn to expand. We learn to stretch. We change. We learn to say sorry. We learn to show up not as a good something or other, but as a self, as a human. And we recognize that connection is the glue. Connection comes from our own self-awareness first, our own work. In the book Motivational Interviewing, which talks a lot about these same kinds of ideas, they write, your purpose is to understand the life before you, to see the world through that person's eyes, rather than superimposing your own vision. Rogers and his students described well the therapeutic skill of accurate empathy. It is to sense the client's inner world of private personal meanings as if it were your own, but without ever losing the as-if quality. The opposite of empathy is the imposition of one's own perspective, perhaps with the assumption that the other's views are irrelevant or misguided. I just confessed this the other day to one of my children. She was talking about her own ADHD and how I minimized it and thought it was a lack of effort, a lack of want to be a positive participant in the family. And I said to her very matter-of-factly, well, I said, I assumed everybody was just like me. I don't have ADHD. So I assumed everybody was like me. And everybody would respond and think the way that I respond and think about things. And she got really elevated, not knowing that I was confessing. And she said, exactly. And I said, yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's how I raised you guys. And as I wrote in The Audacity to Be You, what Rogers is referring to is this idea that sometimes we have to lose our mind. To grow, to transform, to progress, You have to lose ideas that at this moment you hold dear to you. At this moment, you would stake a claim around. But as we learned from Daniel Siegel, the strongest predictor in parenting, the strongest predictor of a child's well-being is a parent's self-understanding, how much a parent has evolved. The strongest predictor of a quality marriage is your own self-awareness. Understanding your own horrible, rotten self, the mess that you are, and the miracle that you are all at once. Put very bluntly, Carl Jung said, you want to understand the identified patient? He said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. Once you understand your mental illness, it might be different or even less than the identified patient. Once you understand it, you'll understand them. Until the shadow, Robin Robertson said, until the shadow is integrated into the personality, the world appears filled with opponents or adversaries who are actually products of the unconsciousness, of the unconscious. Afterward, after integration, people can be seen as individuals or even people who disagree with us. And Gandhi, of course, famously said, the only devils that we should worry about are the ones running around inside of our own head. I love this question by Jung. What if I should discover that the poorest of beggars and the most imprudent of offenders are all within me, and that I stand in need of the alms of my own kindness, that I myself am the enemy who must be loved? What then? Erik Erikson, the great developmental psychologist, said, the more you know yourself, the more patience you have for what you see in others. And one great guru once said, when he was asked, how should we treat others? He responded with, there are no others. And lastly, the Buddha said, if you truly loved yourself, you could not hurt another. In sum, if you do the work to love your horrible, rotten self, the parts of yourself that you discarded or that you were told were unacceptable, the parts that you projected onto others, you will think the problems in your life are the faults of others. You will see the badness out there if you do not learn to love your horrible, rotten self. So the work is to own your feelings, own the parts of you that work against you. Reclaim the parts that you split off in order to survive. And while this is painful, on the other side of it is hope, liberation, and a greater love. One of my favorite quotes in thinking about the identified patient is in the book Addictive Thinking by Abraham Tversky, where he makes the point that every identified patient has excuses for not going into treatment. And paradoxically, ironically, those are the exact same excuses the identified patient, that the non-identified patient has for not entering treatment. He said the mother of a young man was destroying himself with alcohol and other drugs. And she could not understand how he could be so oblivious to the disastrous effects the chemicals were having on his life. She asked for help in dealing with him. But don't tell me, she said, I have to put him out of the house so that I should not bail him out of jail. I don't want to hear that. And the rabbi responded, please tell me how much 2 + 2 is, but don't say 4. She had been unable to see that her own thinking was no less distorted than her son. So the invitation is to become the IP yourself. Become the identified patient in your life. You are the project. You are the problem and the solution of what vexes you. And my question would be, what are you waiting for? What are you waiting for to do your own work, to step into therapy, to go to a 12-step meeting, to come to a Finding You intensive, to go to an intensive somewhere else? I would argue you're probably waiting for the same idea to hit you that the identified patient who's in the depths of their struggles is waiting for. This is not about shame or guilt. That's from your history. This is not about blame. This is about a description about the way things work. And our responsibility is to take back the very responsibility for our own life. Make your serenity and your self-esteem your project, not the child's, not the spouse's. And if you embrace the journey, the painful, difficult journey, you'll also gain access to all of the treasures and the wisdom that this journey has to offer. You want to be the first call to a loved one when they're in a hole, when they're stuck in a corner. And you do that by doing your work, by modeling vulnerability, by showing them how it's done. And ultimately, the scapegoat or you move from the identified patient or the scapegoat to the hero, to be the truth teller. It takes great courage, and I would even argue it is a heroic endeavor to consider the fact that you might be contributing to the problem. That is what the journey of the heroic parent or the journey of the heroic spouse is all about, considering your part in the problem. All right, folks, like I mentioned, June 4th intensive is full. June 23rd has limited space available. I'll be running the Finding Connection workshop with my wife. June 18th, we have a spot there. If you're interested in any of these programs, any feedback, any questions, info@findingyouprograms.com is the email. Go to our website. You can find our coaching or our therapy information there. If you want to come to a 5-day workshop this fall, they'll be run by myself, assisted by my daughter, Emma, the Audacity to Be You. In fact, I've said to some of you that if you've been to Finding You, it's similar. It's going to be very different from Finding You. It's going to be a lot more group exercises, education, lecturing, not so much therapy like we do at Finding You. Finding You is therapy. This will be a combination of therapeutic exercises and psychoeducation. So go to eomega.org. I'll be there in New York, October 12th through 17th at the Omega Institute in Rhinebeck, New York. Price is only $500 for about 5 days. Go to eomega.org and look for the Audacity to Be You workshop. My next broadcast will be 1 week from last night, Tuesday, June 3rd at 6 p.m. I'm going to be talking about behavioral therapy and why behavioral therapy, what its limits are, how it can help us, how to think about it, not just in terms of our spouse or our children, but to think about behavioral change in terms of our own therapy, our own work. So I really look forward to that. All right, folks, I hope this was a helpful point of contact. I hope it made sense. And I hope it's a helpful point of contact throughout your week. For on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, thanks for showing up to these and for your willingness to do your work, because it does make all the difference in the world. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next Tuesday. Take care. Bye-bye.